This is feedback on the homework question, how useful was source E for understanding why Hitler was successful in elections? The source was a picture source which was the front cover from a Social Democrat magazine with the heading, "The Real Meaning of the Hitler Salute." In the exam you would have been given the source, either in colour or black and white. This one was black and white, and this one actually gave you quite a lot of information to explain what the language was on the front, what the words mean, because obviously all of it's written in German. The source description says it describes Hitler as a little man who asks for big gifts, and includes Hitler's claim that millions stand behind me. Published in October 1932, a few months after Hitler made a speech to a meeting of major Rhineland businessmen in Dusseldorf. Now, clearly, you may not know what it means by Rhineland, you may not know what it means by Dusseldorf, both of those are areas in Germany, but I'm sure most people would be able to put together the idea of businessmen and a big meeting that Hitler's at, which is significant in terms of what the source means. Here we see the source in a bit larger, so there's Hitler with his salute, and indeed standing behind him, handing over some money, is the kind of the banker figure or the businessman figure who's huge. Some of you in your work talked about Hitler being small, about him being a little man, and I don't think that's what the source was meaning really. I think the idea was that Hitler is being supported by big business. We use this phrase big business, they use it in today's society, and basically it means big, powerful economic interests. Business support people because they think they can get something out of it. They're looking to make money or connections or influence. And obviously this here, handing over to Hitler the money, is the idea that they will in some way influence what it is that Hitler's going to do to their benefit. And that's quite an important idea in terms of what the Social Democrats were trying to say. Here you've got the bit about millions stand behind me, which was indeed a Hitler phrase. Hitler was talking about millions of people, but here the Social Democrats have twisted that slightly into the idea that millions of marks, millions of German currency stand behind me. I'm an affluent figure because of the support I get. This source did require quite a lot of analysis really. It wasn't an easy and obvious source to use. You needed to talk about the idea of it being a Social Democrat source, which is its provenance, where it's from. Social Democrats are an opposition group to Hitler and the Nazi Party, and this is before Hitler comes to power. This is where your knowledge of chronology is very important. Hitler doesn't achieve chancellorship until January of 1933. This was produced in October of 1932, so Hitler's still trying to win votes, he's still trying to grow the Nazi Party. And the Social Democrats obviously are trying to grow their own party. So here they are criticising Hitler, they're trying to get the voters to vote for them, not him. And it's very carefully targeted. They're targeting workers, because workers are looking for the best deal for them, and there's an implied idea that these people here, in paying Hitler, will not be doing it for the good of the workers, that the workers will lose out for this. So they're playing on the fears of ordinary workers who maybe aren't very rich, who maybe aren't very affluent, to say that Hitler ultimately is being paid off by big business. The mark scheme for all question 1Ds, which are the useful source questions, are very similar, and they run down the idea that you need to talk about the source in relation to its provenance and in relation to its content. So here you see the provenance, and here you see the reference to content. In order to move from level 3 to level 4, not only do you need to explain those two ideas in some detail, but ideally you would need to be able to talk about the link between them. It says evaluate the relative importance or relationship of those two things. So which one's the most important in terms of its usefulness? Is it most useful because of what it says, its content, or is it most useful because of who it's written by its author, by the provenance of it? Or is it useful or not? Because obviously you can talk about it not being useful because of the link between the two. And again, that's where source E required you to talk about the link between who wrote it and what it was saying. Here we have one of the examples that was produced as part of the homework. Starts off, source E was useful for understanding why Hitler was successful. I think that's an excellent start. I think you really need to pin it down in the first sentence about usefulness. Some of the answers did not address the question. If you don't say it's useful or it's not useful, you ultimately haven't answered the question. And on the mark scheme, I don't know where you would default to, possibly to level 1, that you've made general statements about but haven't ultimately answered the question. This particular one, for understanding why Hitler was successful, it talks about written by the Social Democrats. So it's a reference to the provenance of the source, the who wrote it author type idea. Terrible written provenance there. Which were Hitler's oppositions, explains what that means. This meant they probably wrote the article so Hitler would lose votes and support. That's fine. So this person has identified that the provenance, it's useful to understand the source because of what it was trying to do. Now, in fairness, all of the answers we're looking at don't necessarily relate back to the original question. The original question being, how is it useful in understanding Hitler's success in elections? But we'll maybe come back to that in a little bit of time. Here's another source, magazine by the Social Democrat group. So again, we've got identification of the provenance of it. This magazine was published to make Hitler look bad, to make him not win the election. So again, it's explaining why the Social Democrats have published it. Source E is useful in understanding why Hitler was successful. It goes on to talk about the content. It says, millions stand behind me. This can be interpreted in different ways. So this person is talking about content of the source, what it is telling you. They do then go on to say source is from a social democrat, which is opposition to Hitler. It doesn't tell us the opinions of other parties who were opposition, also because it kind of carried on from there. But it has identified content issues, it has identified the provenance issues, and it has said whether it's useful or not. Here we have an answer which identified that the source is not useful, which is perfectly fine. You can say that it's useful, you can say that it's not useful, you can make the balance between the two. I think if you decide to do a bit of both, if you say, well, it is useful for this reason and it's not useful for alternative reasons, you are heading towards level 4 because you are evaluating, you're making a judgment about overall usefulness. Talks about Social Democrats, so it talks about provenance. It talks about the content. Image shows the rich industrialists handing money over to Hitler, but then it goes back to talking about what the Social Democrats wanted out of it. Here's an example of a much more extended piece of work, but similar pattern emerges. Useful. Suggests the Social Democrats were trying to tell people where the Nazis got their money. And it was solely due to this money that Hitler gained electoral success. There you have an answer that really does target the focus of the question. How useful is it in understanding why Hitler was successful? I think if this person had then said, but it's useful in understanding the Social Democrats' view, it's less useful ultimately because of the nature of its provenance, that it may be biased, it may be prejudiced, it may be telling lies. It maybe is less useful in understanding Hitler's success. I think that would have been a very good answer. Talk about attempt to gain support for their own party, which obviously we've talked about in the past. The message of the source was that voting for Hitler was really voting for the people who were in charge. So this is very clearly understood what the source is trying to say, what the Social Democrats are trying to get across, but has made an early link back to the question. Source E wasn't that useful for understanding why Hitler was successful. Says it was on the front cover of a Social Democrat magazine, so provenance. Hitler's oppositions, it also shows so it goes on to describe a little bit of the content. Now I've chopped this answer off, it doesn't ultimately go on to answer the question here, but you can see that there's a definite pattern that you need to be doing. Identify the usefulness, talk about the provenance, talk about the content. Try and link the two things together. So, in summary, I think where you're heading with this answer is identify the usefulness or otherwise of the source, talk about who wrote it, talk about what they have said, and your summary point should link these two ideas together. Move that around a bit. And I think that's where you need to be heading with the answer to how useful is something. Don't know why I've got a question mark in that particular bit there. Delete that out. So, for example, I need to shift this, it will move. Source is useful because it explains that Hitler was supported financially by rich businessmen, which helps to explain how he paid for his election work, e.g. the posters, the radio, the touring. So what I've done there is I've explained that it's useful because it explains that he was supported by the rich businessman and what effect that had in helping him to come to power, what effect that had in helping him with his success on the election. That's a direct answer to the question. What I haven't done yet is talk about the provenance. So how do we talk about the provenance? We say the source is less successful, is less useful in understanding Hitler's success because it was written by a social democrat group who would want to damage Hitler in the eyes of the working class. So they may have exaggerated the claim or the amount of help Hitler was receiving. So a few spelling mistakes in there. And I've sorted my formatting out a little bit so it's a bit more understandable. Saucy is useful because it explains that Hitler was supported financially by rich businessmen, which helps to explain how he paid for his election work, e.g. the posters, the radio, the touring. Remember, he used to fly around the country in an aeroplane. The source is less useful, so I'm balancing my answer in understanding Hitler's success because it was written by a social democrat group who would want to damage Hitler in the eye of working class, so they may have exaggerated the claim or the amount of help Hitler was receiving. I think you need a final summary point of overall judgment about the source in relation to the question, which is how useful was it in helping Hitler come to power, or how useful is it in explaining how Hitler was successful in elections. But I think that's the style. I think you identify where the content might be useful or not, where the provenance might be useful or not, and then you link the two things together to evaluate overall usefulness. I hope this has been useful. I think the key is make sure you understand the source and make sure you think about your P paragraph answers in a way. You need a P paragraph for content, you need a P paragraph for the provenance, the author of the source, and you need a P paragraph for the summary, where you kind of link all of your ideas together.